Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be diving into this one.
Yeah, so imagine watching the most corrupt, deceitful person you know just get a massive promotion.
Oh, that's the worst.
Right. Like they buy a yacht, they live this completely stress-free life, they constantly lie to get ahead, and they never face a single consequence.
Every single one, yeah.
Meanwhile, you're over here, you play by the rules,
Yeah.
you try to maintain your integrity, and you are struggling so hard you can barely pay your rent.
It's exhausting.
It makes you sick to your stomach. It really makes you want to throw your hands up and ask, like, why am I even trying to be a good person here?
Exactly. And 3,000 years ago, a man named Asaph felt exactly that way.
He really did.
He looked at the world, he saw the wicked thriving, and it almost destroyed his entire worldview.
Which is why today we are embarking on a deep dive into an incredibly raw, ancient collection of writings.
Specifically, Psalms 73 through 89.
Yes, and to truly grasp the monumental weight of these texts, we kind of have to rethink who actually wrote them.
We really do.
Because we're primarily looking at the works of figures like Asaph and Ethan the Ezrahite.
Right.
And I think the modern imagination often reduces these guys to quiet, serene figures, just, strumming harps in a corner.
Like soft background music or something.
Exactly. But their actual role in society was so much heavier than that.
Oh, that image of the passive harpist couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, these individuals were the theological and emotional architects of their entire civilization.
Wow. Architects.
Yeah, King David appointed them to preside over the music of the sanctuary.
Which meant what, exactly?
It meant they were the foremost historians, the leading sages, and the primary liturgists.
So they were doing a lot more than just playing instruments.
Oh, absolutely. They were responsible for taking the raw, unfiltered data of human existence, every triumph, every massacre, every famine, every existential crisis, and weaving it into the public liturgy.
That is a massive burden.
It was. When the nation went through a devastating trauma, it was Asaph or Ethan who had to find the words to process that grief.
They were the ones giving voice to it.
Right. They were tasked with the impossible job of reconciling the brutal realities of the world with the belief in a just and loving God.
Which makes them the perfect guides for us today.
Definitely.
Because our mission in this deep dive is to extract the practical wisdom from these ancient texts for you, the listener.
And we need to be clear right up front here, these chapters do not sanitize the human experience at all.
Not even a little bit. We are going to explore profound human struggles.
The real gritty stuff.
Yeah, we're looking at how to process overwhelming unfairness, how to survive the collapse of the systems you trusted, how to fight the kind of midnight anxiety that induces literal insomnia.
Which so many of us deal with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And ultimately, how to hold on to your faith or your principles when reality violently contradicts the promises you were given.
And what's really fascinating here is that the psychological reality presented in these ancient verses is just startlingly modern.
It really is.
I mean, the technology changes, the empires rise and fall, but the human mind grappling with grief, with systemic injustice, with clinical depression, it hasn't fundamentally changed.
The hardware is the same.
Exactly. The 3 a.m. panic attack described in these texts feels identical to the one you might have experienced last night.
Okay, so let's unpack this by starting where our daily frustration so often starts, which is looking outward.
Right, the external world.
Because before we have the capacity to look inward at our own flaws, we usually just look around at our environment.
It's much easier to do.
Yeah. And in Psalm 73, Asaph is looking at a society that feels deeply, structurally unfair.
He's in crisis.
He really is. He is experiencing an acute crisis of unfairness, staring at what we could call the illusion of prosperity.
The core tension Asaph is wrestling with here is the agonizing gap between what he believes about justice and what his eyes actually see happening around him.
The cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. Psalm 73 is essentially a masterclass in articulating this timeless problem. He looks at the arrogant, and the text uses this incredibly vivid language.
I love the imagery here.
It's so good.
Yeah.
He observes that they have no struggles in their death, their eyes bulge with fat, and this is the kicker, violence covers them like a garment.
Violence covers them like a garment. That is just brilliant.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. It's not just something they do, It's what they wear. It's their brand.
Well, if we look closely at that metaphor, it reveals something really profound about the psychology of oppression.
How so?
They aren't hiding their corruption in the shadows, they are flaunting it. They are literally adorned by their ability to dominate others.
Like it's a status symbol.
Right. The text notes that they speak loftily, they set their mouth against the heavens, and their tongue walks through the earth.
Which is just a portrait of absolute unchecked narcissism.
Yeah. Total narcissism. They operate under the assumption that there is no moral fabric to the universe at all. They literally ask in the text, "How doth God know? And is there knowledge in the Most High?"
Meaning they think nobody is watching.
Exactly. They are acting with total impunity. They believe they are completely untouchable.
And Asaph is sitting there trying to live an ethical life, and he just feels completely defeated by it.
You can feel his exhaustion.
You really can. He confesses, "Verily I have cleansed my heart in vain and washed my hands in innocency. For all the day long have I been plagued and chastened every morning."
He's at his breaking point.
He is on the verge of a total moral collapse.
Because he is experiencing a very specific, very corrosive type of envy. It's the temptation to envy the prosperity of the wicked.
Which is different from just normal jealousy.
Very different. This isn't just, wanting a nicer house or a better chariot. It's a crisis of integrity.
Right.
He is looking at the wicked who are completely at ease, effortlessly increasing their wealth, while his own life is full of daily afflictions.
It just feels so backwards to him.
It forces him to question the inherent value of goodness. Like, if the universe doesn't reward ethical behavior and actively seems to reward ruthlessness, then maintaining a moral compass feels like a fool's errand.
Why bother? Right.
Exactly. He actually admits his feet had almost slipped. He almost abandoned his principles entirely.
And translating this to our modern lives, this is literally the ancient equivalent of doom scrolling.
Oh, absolutely.
You open up your newsfeed and you see corporate executives getting these massive golden parachutes after destroying thousands of jobs.
Or politicians facing zero accountability for blatant lies.
Right. And you watch honest, hardworking people struggling just to afford basic groceries. It breeds this incredibly toxic cynicism.
It really does.
You start thinking, am I the idiot for playing by the rules?
And that toxic cynicism is the primary obstacle to spiritual and moral growth. But Asaph documents a massive turning point here.
He finds a way out.
He does. He says the problem was too painful for him to comprehend until he went into the sanctuary of God.
The sanctuary?
Yes. It was only then that he understood their end. He realizes the wicked are actually standing on slippery places and will eventually be brought to ruin.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting, but also where I need to kind of push back a little bit.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because we read that he goes to the sanctuary and suddenly feels better because he realizes the wicked will eventually be destroyed in terrors.
Right.
Is this just ancient schadenfreude? I mean, taking pleasure in someone else's pain?
That's a fair question.
Because I wonder, is Asaph just inventing a coping mechanism to make himself feel better about being one of the losers in society by imagining his enemies burning in the end?
Right, just fantasy revenge.
Yeah, because if so, that doesn't feel like profound wisdom to me. It just feels like petty revenge dressed up as theology.
Well, that is a highly critical, vital question to ask. But if we connect this to the broader philosophical framework of the Psalms, we see it is not about petty revenge at all.
Okay, tell me more.
The sanctuary represents a profound shift in orientation. Asaph shifts from a micro perspective, obsessing over the immediate day-to-day inequalities of his own zip code, to a macro perspective.
He's zooming out.
Exactly. He steps back to look at the eternal timeline. Entering the sanctuary is about remembering the ultimate alignment of cosmic justice.
So how does the text actually define that cosmic justice without it just being, revenge?
We find the mechanics of that justice detailed really beautifully in Psalm 75.
Oh, right, the cup imagery.
Yes. It describes God's judgment using the stark imagery of a cup. It says that in the hand of the Lord there is a cup of red, foaming wine mixed with spices, and he pours it out, and the wicked of the earth will drink it down to the very dregs.
Which sounds intense.
It is intense. And modern listeners often balk at the idea of divine wrath. It feels primitive or harsh to our contemporary sensibilities.
Yeah, we like a gentle, affirming worldview.
Right. But theologians and ancient sages understood that this wrath is the necessary, non-negotiable flip side of profound love and justice.
I see where you're going with this. Because if there is no ultimate consequence, then the universe is fundamentally immoral.
Exactly.
And if it's amoral, then the oppressors actually win the game.
Precisely. If there is no final accounting, If the sociopath and the saint end up in the exact same place with the exact same legacy, then violence and cruelty are objectively the most successful strategies for human existence.
Wow. That's a bleak thought.
It is. The assurance of ultimate cosmic justice is the only thing that allows the oppressed to maintain their sanity and their dignity in an unjust world.
It validates their suffering.
Yes, it affirms that their suffering matters, and that moral truth is real. Asaph realizes that the prosperity of the wicked is incredibly fragile. He actually compares it to a dream when one awakes.
Oh, I love that comparison.
When you are asleep, the nightmare feels entirely permanent and real. But the moment you wake up, it vanishes into nothingness.
It just evaporates.
Exactly. Asaph realizes he was burning with envy over a mirage.
What a powerful reframe. So practical reflection for you listening right now. When you feel totally overwhelmed by the injustice of your workplace or your community or the global news cycle, what is your sanctuary?
Where do you go to retreat?
Yeah, where do you go to physically or mentally pull yourself out of the frantic, immediate doom scrolling and adopt that long-term, eternal perspective?
It's a vital practice.
It really is.
Yeah.
You have to intentionally cultivate a space that reminds you that the current state of things is not the final state of things.
And finding that macro perspective is essential for individual survival. But the text doesn't let us stay in the realm of individual complaints for very long.
No, it shifts gears pretty drastically.
It's one thing to see wicked individuals prospering from afar. It is another level of trauma entirely when those wicked individuals invade your community and actively tear down the institutions you hold sacred.
Right. That brings us to a devastating transition in the text. We move from personal envy to communal devastation.
A huge leap.
Yeah, in Psalms 74 and 79, we are confronting communal trauma and the agonizing silence of systems. And the historical context we are dealing with here is nothing short of catastrophic.
We are looking at the horrific devastation of Jerusalem and the temple, which historically points to the invasion by the Babylonians.
And to understand the psychological weight of this, we have to understand what the temple actually was to these people.
Right, because for the ancient Israelites, the temple was not just a large church building where they went once a week.
It wasn't just a community center.
No, it was the literal intersection of heaven and earth. It was the dwelling place of God, the architectural center of their cosmos, and the anchor of their entire national, cultural, and spiritual identity.
So its destruction meant the literal unmaking of their world.
Completely.
And the sensory details Asaph uses to describe this destruction are just gut-wrenching.
They are very visceral.
He describes the enemies roaring in the midst of the congregations. They set up their military banners right inside the sanctuary as arrogant signs of their victory.
It's a total desecration.
And he makes this heartbreaking historical comparison. He says that in the past, a man was famous and deeply respected if he lifted up axes to cut down timber in the forest to help build a temple.
Right, it was an act of devotion.
Exactly. But now these invaders are taking their axes and hammers and just blindly smashing down all the exquisite, delicately carved wood of the sanctuary.
It's a profound violation. The invaders are acting like mindless lumberjacks in a forest, indiscriminately hacking away at centuries of sacred art, craftsmanship, and devotion.
Just treating it like firewood.
Yeah, and they set the dwelling place of God on fire, burning it to the ground. They destroy all the meeting places in the land.
And in Psalm 79, the imagery plummets into utter horror.
It gets really dark.
It does. The author laments that the dead bodies of the faithful have been given as food to the birds of the sky, and the flesh of the saints to the beasts of the earth.
It's apocalyptic.
Truly, their blood is poured out like water around Jerusalem, and there is no one left alive to even bury them.
It is the absolute collapse of the world as they knew it, but the core wisdom we have to extract here isn't just about the historical event.
Right, it's about the internal experience.
Exactly. It's about how the human mind processes this level of collapse, especially when the higher power they trusted seems completely, deafeningly silent.
To me, the single most agonizing verse in this entire section is Psalm 74, verse 9.
Which one is that?
Asaph writes, "We see no miraculous signs. There is no longer any prophet, neither is there among us anyone who knows how long."
Oh, yeah. That phrase captures the absolute terrifying void of trauma.
It really does.
Because the physical destruction of the city is horrific, but the spiritual and administrative silence is what makes it truly unbearable.
Right, they're used to getting some kind of guidance.
Historically, whenever a crisis occurred, God either intervened directly or at the very least sent a prophet to explain why it was happening and what the timeline was.
Giving them a framework.
Exactly. But now, there is no explanation. There is no divine voice. Just smoke, ruins, and an endless silence.
And if we translate this to our modern realities, this is exactly how we react when our foundational systems completely fail us.
Think about governments during a catastrophic failure.
Or economies entering a freefall. Or even massive betrayals within religious or medical institutions that we implicitly trusted to protect us.
When those systemic pillars collapse, the anxiety is staggering.
That specific phrase, anyone who knows how long, is the hallmark of modern crisis.
It really is.
Think about the early dark days of a global pandemic or a sudden devastating economic depression. The hardest part, the thing that truly breaks people's sanity, isn't always the immediate physical hardship.
It's the uncertainty.
Right. It is the agonizing uncertainty of the timeline.
The human brain can endure immense suffering if it has an endpoint. But ambiguous loss suffering with an indeterminate timeline is psychological torture.
It makes me think of standing in the ashes of a family home after a devastating fire.
That's a great analogy.
You aren't just mourning the lumber and the drywall. You are mourning the memories, the sense of safety, the trajectory of your life.
Everything that grounded you.
Exactly. Everything that told you who you were and that you were safe has been incinerated.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic loss. And what is so vital about these ancient wisdom traditions is how they model our response to that loss.
They don't sugarcoat it.
Not at all. Notice how the text absolutely refuses to sanitize the grief. The Psalms demand that we look at the raw, bloody, terrifying reality of life.
There's no toxic positivity here.
None. Asaph doesn't offer empty platitudes. He doesn't say, well, everything happens for a reason. We just need to trust the plan.
Right. Instead, he just screams into the void.
He does. He brings his boldest, rawest questions to the table. He actively argues with God.
He utilizes a very specific, almost aggressive rhetorical strategy, doesn't he?
He does. He reminds God of his past mythic interventions to almost provoke him into action. He brings up the parting of the Red Sea.
And he talks about God crushing the heads of Leviathan.
Right. Now, for the ancient Near East, Leviathan wasn't just a big fish. It was the mythic, multi-headed sea monster that represented primordial chaos.
Like the untamable ocean.
Exactly. And the oppressive power of empires like Egypt. Asaph is saying, you are the god who slays the ultimate dragons of chaos. You split oceans. Why are you sitting back with your hands in your pockets while your sanctuary burns and your people are slaughtered?
Which is incredibly bold. And it brings us to a crucial practice for you, the listener, the art of the lament.
We've really lost this art.
We have. In our modern hyper-optimized culture, we are so quick to try and fix grief. We try to medicate it. We try to find the hidden life lesson in it, or we try to hustle our way out of it.
We want a quick resolution.
Right. But when you are faced with catastrophic loss, the wisdom here is to not censor your grief. You have permission to be utterly devastated.
Let yourself feel it.
Bring your rawest anger to whatever higher power you believe in, or to the universe itself. Ask how long. Demand answers.
Because the very act of lamenting is, ironically, a profound act of faith.
Wait, how so?
Because it assumes there is still a relationship there. It assumes there is someone listening who should care. A lament is a cry of relationship, not a cry of atheism.
Oh, that's a brilliant distinction.
You don't yell at an empty room, you know. You yell at someone you believe is in the room with you.
Right. You're holding them accountable to the relationship.
Exactly. But this raises an important question. What happens when that external communal trauma begins to manifest internally?
When you take the pain inside.
Right. When the city is burned and the lament is offered, but the silence just continues.
That is exactly where the narrative takes us next. We zoom in from the burning ruins of a nation to the suffocating confines of the individual mind.
It gets very claustrophobic.
It does. In Psalm 77, we are looking at the anatomy of melancholy and the battle of the mind. The trauma has fully internalized.
We are entering the territory of a deeply personal, acute mental health crisis.
The text is shockingly clinical here.
The historical and human context here is an individual in a state of severe, agonizing distress. The author documents his physical symptoms with startling accuracy.
He says, "My sore ran in the night and ceased not."
And another translation captures the restlessness even better. My hand was stretched out in the night and didn't get tired.
A tossing and turning.
Yes. And then he describes the insomnia. You hold my eyelids open. He is so exhausted, so paralyzed by panic that he says, I am so troubled that I cannot speak.
It's like he's going catatonic from stress.
The physiological response to his grief is just overwhelming. He is trapped in that deep, dark pit where even the memory of better times becomes a weapon that his brain uses against him.
Oh, that is the worst feeling.
He says, I call to remembrance my song in the night. He remembers when he used to have joy, when he used to feel light enough to sing.
And the stark contrast between that past joy and his current terror just pours salt in the wound.
As classical commentators like Matthew Henry have noted, grief becomes true melancholy when it admits of no intermission and no consolation.
It just won't let up.
The author explicitly states, my soul refused to be comforted. He is catastrophizing. He begins to spiral, asking these terrifying absolute questions.
Like, will the Lord cast off forever? Is his mercy clean gone forever? Doth his promise fail forevermore? Hath God forgotten to be gracious?
This is a staggering depiction of clinical depression and acute anxiety.
Totally. Anyone who has ever laid awake at 3 a.m., heart pounding out of their chest, mind racing uncontrollably through worst-case scenarios.
Completely unable to articulate the dread they feel.
Exactly. They know exactly the geography of Asaph's mind right here. He is looking at his current darkness, and his brain is telling him that the sun has not just set, but that the sun has been permanently extinguished.
That's a powerful way to put it. But then we hit verse 10.
The pivot point.
Which is arguably the pivot point in the entire psychological journey in the Psalms. He is in the middle of this absolute spiral, and suddenly he says, and I said, this is my infirmity.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is where we need some serious discernment.
It's a troubling verse.
He says, this is my infirmity. How do we distinguish between a legitimate, objective spiritual crisis, where the world really is falling apart and systems really are broken, and our own brain simply lying to us through a cognitive distortion?
That is the absolute genius of this moment. It is a moment of profound, almost shocking self-awareness that mirrors modern cognitive behavioral therapy.
CBT in the ancient world.
Seriously. In the middle of his panic, Asaph suddenly realizes that his despair is a symptom of his own limited, exhausted perspective.
He catches his own brain in a lie.
He does. He realizes that concluding God has abandoned the universe forever is not an objective fact about reality. It's a failure of his own perception.
It's a product of his exhaustion and trauma.
And his fear. His infirmity is his distorted thinking.
So once he recognizes the cognitive distortion, what is the mechanism he uses to stop the spiral?
He pivots by actively, forcefully commanding his mind to remember historical facts outside of his current emotional state.
He changes the channel?
He says, I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old.
He's angering himself.
He shifts his focus from his internal, highly subjective feelings of abandonment to the external, objective history of deliverance. He specifically meditates on the Exodus.
Right, on God bringing Israel out of Egypt and parting the Red Sea.
And as he recounts the parting of the sea, he writes a line that offers so much profound comfort. He says, thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps were not known.
I want to pause here.
Yeah.
Because that is so poetic. But what does it actually mean to follow footsteps that are not known?
Well, think about the physics of the Red Sea narrative. When God led the Israelites through the waters, the ocean walled up on either side, they walked across dry land, and then the waters crashed back down behind them.
Wiping out the path.
Exactly. There were no footprints left in the water, no trail marker, no physical evidence that a path had ever been there. God's methods of deliverance often leave absolutely no visible tracks. When you are going through the deepest, most chaotic waters of your life, you might look around and see absolutely no evidence of a plan.
You might see no footprints to follow at all.
But the wisdom here is that just because you can't see the path doesn't mean the path isn't there.
Just because you can't see the path doesn't mean the path isn't there. That is incredible.
God's way is often forged directly through the very chaos that threatens to drown you, leaving no trace for the rational mind to analyze until after you've already crossed.
So the question for you to mull over in your own life, when your mind spirals into worst-case scenarios at 3 a.m., what objective truths, what past victories can you force yourself to remember?
You have to find that anchor.
How can you break the loop of your own cognitive distortion, your infirmity, by recalling a time when a way was made for you through the impossible, even when it left no footprints?
It requires immense mental discipline to redirect your thoughts like that, pulling yourself out of the subjective emotional spiral and grounding yourself in objective historical memory.
It really does. And if remembering the past is the cure for personal despair, the texts show us that forgetting the past is the absolute root of societal ruin.
Which is a perfect bridge into our next exploration.
Yeah, we are moving from the preservation of the individual mind to the preservation of a culture. In Psalm 78 and 81, we are dealing with generational amnesia and the danger of toxic desires.
Psalm 78 is explicitly titled a mashil, which means a didactic psalm, a psalm of instruction.
It's meant to teach a lesson.
It is actually the longest psalm in this section, and its entire architectural purpose is to prevent generational amnesia.
To keep them from forgetting.
Right. Asaph begins by calling the community to attention, essentially saying, listen to me, we are going to tell our children the dark sayings of old.
The dark sayings, not just the highlights reel.
Exactly. We are not going to hide our ugly history from the next generation so that they don't turn out to be a stubborn and rebellious generation like their ancestors. He is meticulously laying out the cyclical, predictable trap of human nature.
And if we trace that cycle through the text, it's remarkably consistent, isn't it?
It's basically a formula.
God delivers the people from slavery. The people become comfortable. That comfort metastasizes into complacency.
And complacency turns into toxic entitlement and active rebellion.
Right. Then God eventually allows them to face the consequences of their rebellion. They experience terror and offer fake, desperate repentance.
This crocodile tears.
Yeah. God, out of sheer illogical compassion, shows them undeserved mercy. They are rescued, they become comfortable again, and the cycle violently restarts.
And Asaph illustrates this cycle by zooming in on the Exodus narrative, focusing specifically on the wilderness wanderings.
Right.
God has just split the sea. He is guiding them with a supernatural cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He splits solid rocks in the desert to give them rushing rivers of water.
Miracle after miracle.
They have manna, which the text calls angels' food, appearing every single morning to keep them alive. But it says the people tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust.
They literally have the audacity to look at the sky, surrounded by daily miracles, and ask cynically, can God furnish a table in the wilderness?
The arrogance of that question is just astounding.
It really is, because they aren't asking for food because they're starving. They have the manna. They are demanding a luxurious feast simply to satisfy their cravings.
They want the rich, seasoned meats of Egypt.
Completely glossing over the fact that Egypt was where their children were thrown into the Nile and they were brutally enslaved.
They got selective amnesia.
They are romanticizing their past trauma because they are bored with their current menu.
But this brings us to some very difficult concepts, some major obstacles to growth for modern listeners.
Because God's response is intense.
How God responds to this entitlement is shocking. In Psalm 78, God actually gives them the meat. He sends a wind that brings massive flocks of quail, raining them down like dust around the camp.
Sounds like a good thing at first.
But then the text says, while the meat was yet in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them and slew the fattest of them.
Wow.
And then, expanding on this theme in Psalm 81, God makes a statement that is almost more terrifying than physical judgment. He says, so I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels.
Okay, let's explore the mechanics of this judgment. Because at first glance, it just sounds like a deity losing his temper and striking people down for wanting a good meal.
It sounds petty if you don't understand it.
Right. But I think there's a profound psychological reality here. Imagine a survivalist who is lost in the deep wilderness.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
They have a basic ration of nutrient-based. It's bland, it's boring, but it provides the exact caloric and nutritional profile they need to survive the brutal 10-mile hike back to civilization.
Exactly what they need.
Right. But the survivalist throws a tantrum. They hate the paste. Then, they stumble upon an abandoned crate filled entirely with refined sugar candy.
Oh, boy.
They gorge themselves on it. It satisfies their immediate craving, they feel completely full, and it tastes amazing.
But it's toxic in that context.
Exactly. It severely spikes their blood sugar, offers zero complex nutrients, and leaves them violently ill and lethargic a few hours later. They get exactly what they demanded, but the candy ruins their physical capacity to actually survive the journey out of the woods.
That is such a vivid picture.
God giving Israel the quail is like handing that survivalist the candy crate.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the underlying mechanism here. What we are seeing here is not a temper tantrum from God. It is a profound commentary on the danger of unchecked appetite.
Sometimes getting what you want is the worst thing that can happen.
Exactly. The most severe, devastating judgment of God is sometimes simply giving us exactly what we relentlessly demand. We are conditioned to think that getting our way is always a blessing.
But the text observes that they were well-filled, but not estranged from their lust.
They got the feast, but their souls were poisoned by their own entitlement. Luxury and the relentless, unchecked pursuit of our own desires can actually destroy our capacity for spiritual and moral survival.
And what's really unsettling about that is how they react when they face the consequences of gorging on their own desires.
They don't really learn the lesson, do they?
Not at all. The text notes that even when they suffered, their repentance was completely hollow. It says, "They did flatter him with their mouth, and they lied unto him with their tongues, for their heart was not right with him."
They were just trying to avoid the pain of the consequences.
Yeah, they were sorry they got a stomach ache, not sorry for their arrogant entitlement.
Exactly. And Psalm 81 reinforces this tragic reality. I gave them up unto their own heart's lust. When a culture or an individual violently insists on walking in their own counsels, completely refusing all ancient wisdom and moral boundaries, the ultimate consequence is that they are left to their own devices.
Which is terrifying.
And historically, human devices, when unmoored from moral truth, lead to catastrophic ruin. The generational amnesia Asaph is fighting isn't just about forgetting historical dates.
No, it's deeper than that.
It's about forgetting the moral framework that keeps a society from cannibalizing itself.
So reflecting on this for your own life, take a hard look at your current desires. What are you ruthlessly chasing right now?
What's your quail?
Exactly. Are you demanding a table in the wilderness out of pure lust and entitlement, completely ignoring the provision of the peace you already have? Are you gorging on something that is secretly destroying your capacity to finish the journey?
That is a tough question to ask yourself.
It is. And on a broader scale, how are you intentionally passing down the dark sayings of old, the painful, hard-earned lessons you've learned through your own failures, to the next generation so they don't have to repeat your mistakes?
We really owe it to the future to be ruthlessly honest about our failures. And that radical honesty is what makes the Psalms so enduring, and it prepares us for the final and perhaps the most complex part of our deep dive today.
Yeah, because we have spent a lot of time seeing how Israel failed God, how they forgot his miracles and demanded their own way.
But the script flips here.
It does. What about the moments when it feels entirely like God has failed us? What happens when the divine promises themselves seem to shatter?
This is the hard stuff.
We are entering our final exploration, holding the paradox of promises and reality, looking at Psalms 85 and 89.
This is the ultimate tension of mature faith. Holding on to a divine promise when your daily lived reality directly and violently contradicts it. Here, Ethan the Ezrahite steps into the spotlight with Psalm 89.
And understanding the historical and theological context of this specific psalm is critical.
It really is. Psalm 89 begins with soaring, majestic praise for the Davidic covenant.
We need to explain what that covenant actually was, because for the original audience, this wasn't just a nice theological concept, it was everything.
The Davidic covenant refers to the unconditional promise God made to King David in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 7. God promised David that his royal house, his kingdom, and his throne would be established forever.
An eternal dynasty.
Exactly. That his offspring would endure as long as the sun and moon in the sky. For the ancient Israelites, this promise was the bedrock of their national hope. It was their absolute guarantee of political and spiritual security.
As long as the son of David was on the throne, they believed they could not be destroyed.
Ethan spends the first 37 verses of Psalm 89 just hyping up this promise, talking about how faithful God is and how his covenant cannot possibly be broken.
But then, at verse 38, there's this whiplash-inducing shift. The beautiful, soaring poetry completely shatters against the rocks of reality.
It is one of the most violent pivots in all of ancient literature. Ethan suddenly writes, "But you have rejected and spurned. You have renounced the covenant of your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. You have broken down all his hedges."
He is looking at a reality where the kingdom has been brutally invaded.
The city defenses are destroyed, the king is a disgraced laughingstock, and the eternal throne is literally lying in the dirt.
The promise was eternal, unshakable security, but the physical reality is absolute, humiliating ruin.
It's a total contradiction.
How do you live in that space?
Yes.
This is the core wisdom we have to extract here. How to exist in the agonizing, already but not yet, It requires a profound, almost painful psychological synthesis to hold deep, abiding faith and agonizing, visceral disappointment in the exact same moment without letting one destroy the other.
It really does. And to understand the theological mechanics of how one survives that tension, we need to bring in a vital philosophical concept from Psalm 85.
Okay, let's hear.
There's a verse there, verse 10, that is considered one of the most beautiful yet mathematically complex verses in all of Scripture. It says, "Mercy and truth are met together, righteousness and peace have kissed each other."
Let's really dive deep into that, because on the surface, those words just sound like nice poetic synonyms.
But they're not.
Right, they're actually describing a massive, almost irreconcilable conflict.
They are fundamentally opposed forces in human logic. Think about truth and mercy. Truth demands that reality be fully acknowledged and accounted for. If a crime is committed, truth says this person is guilty and justice requires a penalty. Truth is rigid and exacting.
It doesn't bend.
But mercy is unmerited favor. Mercy says, I forgive you, the penalty is waived, the debt is canceled.
So they naturally cancel each other out.
Exactly. If you have absolute truth, you must execute the penalty, which means you have no mercy. If you offer absolute mercy, you ignore the crime, which means you violate the truth.
And it is the exact same tension with righteousness and peace. Righteousness is about justice, about making things fair, about righting systemic wrongs and punishing oppressors.
But peace is about harmony, stillness, and the absence of conflict.
In human politics, you almost always have to sacrifice one to achieve the other.
Always.
If you want peace in a fractured society, you might have to grant amnesty to corrupt leaders and ignore historical injustice, basically sacrificing righteousness.
And if you demand righteousness and insist on punishing every injustice, you usually have to go to war to achieve it, entirely destroying the peace. That is the tragedy of human governance. They're competing virtues. But the ultimate claim of God's wisdom, the grand design of the cosmos, according to the biblical authors, is that these opposing forces are perfectly reconciled in the divine nature.
Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other.
The ultimate divine promise is that eventually justice will be perfectly and totally served without destroying cosmic harmony, and the brutal reality of human sin will be fully acknowledged while still extending infinite grace.
But if we trace that logic back to Psalm 89, Ethan isn't seeing that grand reconciliation.
No, he's not.
He is just seeing the crown in the dust. He spends verses 38 through 51 detailing the ruin, and he starts begging God to remember how short human life is.
He's getting desperate.
He cries out, "Remember how short my time is. For what vanity hast thou created all the children of men?" He's essentially saying, Lord, if you are going to fulfill this promise where mercy and truth kiss, you have to do it right now, because I am going to die soon and I will never see it.
And then, after pages of agonizing complaint, we hit the final verse of the psalm, verse 52.
The ending.
And it is so abrupt it almost feels like a clerical error. It simply says, "Blessed be the Lord forevermore. Amen and amen."
It's a doxology.
Right. A doxology is a short liturgical formula of praise to God. The word comes from the Greek doxa, meaning glory, and logia, meaning saying. It is a standardized declaration of God's ultimate goodness.
But how? How can Ethan the Ezrahite, after detailing the absolute destruction of his nation, after accusing God of breaking his sacred covenant and throwing the king's crown into the dirt, suddenly end on a doxology?
It feels disjointed.
His world is still literally on fire. His deeply painful questions remain completely unanswered. Is he just giving up? Is this some sort of ancient religious Stockholm syndrome where he just fakes a smile at the end?
This raises the ultimate question of the entire text, and it is the crucible of mature faith. This abrupt doxology is not a blind, lobotomized endorsement of suffering.
It's not the toxic positivity.
It is certainly not that. It is a radical, muscular choice of orientation. By choosing to bless God in the absolute dark, Ethan is refusing to let his current temporal circumstances dictate his ultimate reality.
He is actively defying his own despair.
Yes. He is sitting in the smoking wreckage of the promise, holding the broken, jagged pieces in his hands and saying, I don't understand this. This hurts beyond language. It feels like you lied to me, but I am still going to orient my soul toward your ultimate goodness.
Wow.
When he reminds God of his mortality, remember how short my time is, it isn't just a bitter complaint. It's an urgent, desperate plea for God to act within the sphere of his own lifetime.
But the doxology proves that even if God doesn't act before Ethan dies, Ethan's final word will still be a blessing.
He is holding the unbearable tension.
So the practice for you, the listener, as we wrap up this journey. When you are holding a shattered promise in your own hands, whether that is a marriage that failed despite your best efforts, a career that collapsed unfairly, or a medical diagnosis that fundamentally changed the trajectory of your life, can you sit in that agonizing tension?
It's so hard to do.
It is. Can you voice your deepest, most raw disappointment to God or to the universe, refusing to sanitize your grief while simultaneously choosing to remain open to hope? Can you sit in the dark and wait for the ultimate moment where mercy and truth finally meet?
It is the hardest, most grueling work a human being can do, but is the only way to walk through the darkness without losing your soul.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over, a concept to take with you as you navigate your own tensions and shattered promises.
Let's hear it.
Think back to that incredible haunting image from Psalm 77 of God's footsteps hidden in the sea. We've talked extensively about the struggle, the unfairness of the wicked prospering, the trauma of failing systems, and the agony of delayed expectations.
The whole spectrum of human pain.
Yeah. What if the areas of your life where you feel the absolute most abandoned right now, the places where you look around and see absolutely no trace of a plan, no footprints to follow, nothing but chaotic, terrifying water, what if those are actually the exact waters where your greatest deliverance is being forged entirely out of sight?
That's a beautiful thought.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.